It was December 1944, in the dying winter of the Second World War. Snow blanketed the Ardennes forest, muffling the chaos of battle above. Beneath that frozen silence, a small squad of American soldiers uncovered something that would outlast every explosion, every bullet, and every scream of war. They had been searching for enemy supply routes when they found a half-buried entrance, hidden behind collapsed timber and mud. The doorway led downward into a narrow tunnel of cold stone. The air was still, thick with the scent of rust and earth. What waited inside had been untouched for years. At the tunnel's end stood a rusted steel door. It took 3 men to force it open. The soldiers expected weapons, maps, or perhaps bodies. Instead, they found silence, and a room filled with canvas mailbags stamped with the eagle of the German army. When they cut one open, it was not ammunition that spilled out, but hundreds of letters, some tied with string, others sealed with wax, many still bearing traces of perfume or the careful handwriting of people long gone. Each envelope carried a voice, wives writing to husbands, sons to fathers, soldiers to lovers they would never see again. Words of hope, fear, and tenderness, frozen in time beneath the soil of war. The men stood motionless, surrounded by the ghosts of sentences that had never reached their home. In that moment, the war above felt distant. The sound of it faded into nothing compared to the quiet power of those forgotten pages. What began as a military patrol became something else entirely, a doorway into the most human part of a brutal, mechanical war. The discovery took place in the final winter of the war, when the German army was desperate and the Allies were exhausted. Europe was a ruin of smoke and silence. Cities once alive with laughter now stood hollow and broken. Every mile the soldiers advanced was another reminder of what war had taken away. The Ardennes region of Belgium and Luxembourg had become a frozen labyrinth of trees, hills, and shadows. American troops had dug themselves into the icy ground, their breath turning to mist in the bitter air. They had fought their way across France after D-Day, believing the end was near. But in December 1944, Hitler launched one final furious counterattack. The Battle of the Bulge. The weather turned against the Allies. Fog rolled in thick and low, grounding aircraft. Snow covered tank tracks and made every movement slow. Soldiers trudged through knee-deep drifts, their boots soaked, their rations frozen. Communication lines failed, and confusion reigned. The Germans used the weather to strike hard and fast, splitting the Allied lines. What followed was chaos. Towns captured, supply lines cut, units surrounded. In the midst of this chaos, one small American reconnaissance unit was ordered to sweep through abandoned villages near the Siegfried Line. Their task was simple: locate German communication points and hidden bunkers that could still pose a threat. They moved cautiously, checking every cellar, every half-collapsed structure, every ridge that looked unnatural in the snow. By then, the men were more tired than afraid. They had seen enough destruction to numb even their strongest emotions. Villages were burned-out shells. Family photos still hung crooked on the walls of homes with no roofs. The only movement came from the snow falling through the holes in the ceiling. When they reached a cluster of half-destroyed farmhouses near a small forest clearing, they noticed something odd. A faint outline in the ground, a square patch where the snow didn't settle. Beneath it lay a hidden trapdoor covered in frozen dirt and branches. It was the kind of detail most would miss, but these men had learned to see through camouflage. They dug it open and found a shaft leading down into darkness. The air that came out was colder than the wind above, carrying the stale scent of confinement. This was no ordinary cellar. It was military. German engineering, a bunker buried deep enough to survive artillery fire. Rumors had long circulated among Allied troops about the hidden German letter depots, places where undelivered mail from the front was stored, either for censorship, intelligence review, or simple logistical collapse. But few had ever been found. Most were destroyed in retreat, burned to prevent sensitive information from falling into enemy hands. This, it seemed, was one of the few that survived, and it had been waiting, untouched, for more than a year. The soldiers didn't know it yet, But what they were about to uncover wasn't just evidence of a forgotten postal system. It was something far deeper, a collection of voices that the war itself had silenced. These weren't the official records of generals or strategists. They weren't reports about ammunition or supply shortages. They were the raw, unfiltered thoughts of ordinary men and women living through the unthinkable. The laughter that hid fear, the hope that survived hunger, the love that refused to die even when nations fell apart. The soldiers would later describe the atmosphere in that bunker as heavy, not from air or dust, but from emotion. The moment they realized what they were looking at, the war around them seemed to pause. It was as though time itself held its breath, allowing them to listen. For the first time, these men, trained to destroy, to fight, to survive, stood before something fragile, something human. And they couldn't yet imagine how these letters, forgotten in a sealed room beneath the ground, would go on to tell one of the most haunting and beautiful stories of the entire war. The men returned the next morning with reinforcements. The snow had hardened overnight, and the sky hung low and gray, as if even the sun refused to witness what lay beneath. Word of the discovery spread quickly through the unit. Some thought it was just another abandoned supply cache. Others joked nervously that the bunker might be booby-trapped, filled with explosives or gas. But none of them could ignore the curiosity that had begun to grow, a pull stronger than fear. When they descended again, lanterns in hand, they could see more clearly this time. The walls were lined with wooden shelves reinforced by metal brackets, each stacked with sealed mailbags, boxes, and smaller tins labeled with German markings. It was a postal archive, not military intelligence, but something more personal. One bag after another, all marked Feldpost, the German military postal service. The soldiers began to open them carefully. Out came bundles of letters, hundreds upon hundreds, neatly tied in groups with faded string. The paper had yellowed, some corners burned, others damp from years of condensation. Yet the handwriting remained clear. Names, addresses, even tiny hearts drawn beside signatures. Private Harris read the first line of one letter aloud. It was from a young woman in Dresden, dated early 1943. She wrote to her husband on the Eastern Front, promising she would keep the candle burning until his return. She never learned that his regiment was wiped out weeks later. The letter was never delivered. Another envelope contained a child's drawing, a stick-figure soldier holding hands with a smaller figure beneath a bright sun. It was addressed simply, "To Papa, wherever you are." As they sifted through the letters, the mood changed. What began as curiosity turned into silence. The soldiers realized they were holding the last words of lives erased by war. Confessions, dreams, goodbyes. Some letters had stains that might have been water or tears or blood. Sergeant Miller found an unopened envelope that had been carefully wrapped in cloth. Inside was a photograph of a young couple on their wedding day. The woman's smile seemed alive, her veil bright against the darkness of the bunker. On the back, the husband had written, "I will return before the snow melts." That winter had long passed. One soldier, Corporal Dunn, had lost his brother in Normandy. He sat on a crate turning a letter over and over in his hands, whispering, "They were just like us." The others nodded. For the first time in months, they weren't thinking about strategy or front lines or orders. They were thinking about home, their own letters, waiting for them in some distant post office or carried in a pocket close to the heart. But as the men kept searching, something strange caught Miller's attention. Beneath the pile of mailbags was a metal crate with a different insignia. Inside were packets labeled "Geprüft," checked. These were letters that had been opened and reviewed by German censors. Some had notes attached by intelligence officers, small annotations about morale or discontent. It became clear that this bunker wasn't just a post depot. It was a censorship station, a place where the thoughts and emotions of thousands of soldiers and civilians had been filtered, judged, and often silenced. Letters expressing fear or doubt were never sent. Many were confiscated, buried here. The emotional casualties of propaganda and control. The discovery shook the Americans. The enemy they had fought for months suddenly felt more human than ever. Behind the lines and uniforms were people just as fragile, just as desperate to be heard. The men felt an unspoken obligation. These letters couldn't remain forgotten. They gathered as many as they could carry and brought them back to command. The higher officers were skeptical at first. Why waste time on enemy mail when artillery still thundered miles away? But when a translator began reading some of them aloud, the room fell silent. A mother wrote to her son about the smell of rain in spring, hoping he'd remember it on the front. A nurse described the sound of distant bombers over Berlin, trying to reassure her husband she was safe. A soldier confessed he no longer believed in victory, only in survival. Each word peeled away the layers of ideology that had divided the world. The Americans began to realize that they were holding something irreplaceable, a record of ordinary humanity trapped beneath extraordinary horror. The letters were packed carefully and sent to a field headquarters for preservation. But before they left the area, Sergeant Miller insisted on returning to the bunker one last time. He wanted to see it again, to make sure nothing else was left behind. When he stepped inside, the light from his torch flickered over the walls. He noticed something he hadn't before, a section of plaster that looked newer than the rest, as if someone had sealed it recently. He struck it with the butt of his rifle. The plaster cracked. Inside was a small compartment containing a single letter sealed in wax. It was addressed simply, "And die Zukunft," to the future. Miller stared at it for a long time, not knowing whether to open it or leave it as it was. In that moment, the weight of the entire war seemed to hang on that envelope. What message had someone wanted to send across time, to people not yet born? He slipped the letter into his coat pocket, unsure why. Maybe because some messages are meant to be found, not destroyed, and though the men did not yet know it, that single envelope, "to the future," would one day become the key to understanding not just the letters themselves, but the people who wrote them, and the war that swallowed their voices. Days later, the battle moved on. The unit was reassigned, the front shifting like a tide that never stayed still. Yet the discovery of the letters lingered in their minds. For Miller especially, the envelope marked "to the future" felt heavier with each passing day. He couldn't explain why, but he carried it with care, as though it were something alive. When the fighting quieted, he finally opened it. Inside was a single sheet of paper, written in elegant, slanted handwriting. The ink had faded to brown, but the words were still clear. It began simply, "To whoever finds this, you are reading what we could not say aloud." The writer explained that the bunker had been a secret field post center in 1943. It was manned not by soldiers, but by clerks and translators assigned to monitor morale within the German army. Their job was to intercept and censor letters that might weaken the spirit of the Reich. They had read thousands of messages, stories of exhaustion, fear, love, and doubt, and had been ordered to destroy them all. But instead of burning them, the small team hid them here, sealing the room in defiance. The letter continued, "We could not bear to erase these voices. They belong to people who will never return. And perhaps, one day, someone will remember them as more than soldiers or enemies, as human beings." The writer signed only with initials, E.K. No rank, no title, no full name. Just the trace of conscience in a time when conscience could cost a life. For Miller and his men, it was a revelation. They had spent months fighting the German army, faceless, relentless, mechanical. Yet here was proof that even inside that machinery, there had been people who resisted quietly, choosing compassion over command. The Americans decided to protect the letters. They labeled and stored them in military crates, intending to hand them over to historians after the war. But before they could, orders came in. Their position was being overrun. They had to retreat immediately. Shells began to fall around them. The ground shook as artillery thundered through the forest. Smoke and snow blended into one suffocating haze. The men rushed to evacuate, carrying as much as they could. Miller clutched the letter to the future inside his jacket. A shell landed close by, tearing through the air. Harris, the young private who had first opened a bag of letters, was thrown to the ground. When Miller reached him, he saw the glint of blood on the snow. Harris's voice was weak, barely a whisper. "Don't let them burn," he said. "They don't deserve that." Miller nodded, though he knew they couldn't save them all. The truck was already full, the crates stacked tight. Dozens of mailbags had to be left behind in the chaos. As they drove away, the bunker collapsed under bombardment, its entrance swallowed by earth and smoke. For years afterward, Miller wondered what had survived. He never spoke publicly about the letters, not even in his post-war interviews. He kept the single envelope and its contents in a small wooden box, wrapped in cloth. He said it reminded him that even in the darkest parts of war, decency had found a way to endure. Decades later, after Miller's death, his grandson found the box in an attic in Ohio. Inside was the letter, "To the Future," carefully preserved, along with a faded photograph, a group of weary soldiers standing before a half-buried bunker. On the back, Miller had written, "Ardennes, 1944. We found their words. We kept them safe." Historians traced the story and reopened records that had been forgotten for generations. With permission from archives in Germany and Belgium, a joint restoration effort began. Teams of linguists and preservationists dug into the soil near the old battlefield. In 1987, fragments of the bunker were uncovered again, and inside, miraculously, several crates still intact. Thousands of letters, still legible. Each one told a fragment of a world that had vanished. A baker from Munich writing to his fiancée, a medic describing the faces of the wounded, a young girl promising to write again when the air raids stopped. For the first time in history, both sides of the war spoke together, not through politics or victory, but through ink and paper. The letters were published in exhibitions across Europe under the title "Voices Beneath the War." People stood before the displays and wept, recognizing names that had long faded from memory. The letter marked "To the Future" was framed in the center of the exhibit. Beneath it, a plaque read, "Discovered by American soldiers, written by those who refused to let humanity die." What began as a patrol through snow and silence had become something far greater, a bridge across time, built by people who believed that words could outlive war itself. When the letters were finally displayed to the world, they changed how people remembered the war. For decades, history had spoken in the voices of generals, commanders, and victors. But these pages came from the margins, from nurses, farmers, children, and ordinary soldiers who had lived and died without recognition. Their words were small, but they carried more truth than any military report ever could. Visitors at the exhibitions often stood in silence for long minutes. Some searched the names, hoping to find a relative or a trace of a story told long ago. Others simply read, quietly, and left with eyes that seemed heavier. Many said it was the first time they had felt the war as something real, not as strategy or politics, but as a collection of interrupted lives. Historians noted that the tone of these letters revealed a side of Germany that official propaganda had erased. There was disillusionment, sorrow, fear, and even guilt, emotions censored out of public life during the war. Some writers questioned the orders they followed. Others begged forgiveness for what they had seen or done. And among them were countless notes of love, fragile threads connecting people across continents and chaos. For the Americans who had first uncovered the bunker, those words lived on long after the war. Some of the surviving veterans visited the exhibition when it toured the United States. They recognized the faces in old photographs, remembered the smell of dust and paper in that underground room. Miller's grandson recalled how his grandfather rarely spoke about combat, but always paused when talking about the letters. He said it was the only moment when the old man's voice would soften. In time, the letters found permanent homes in museums in Berlin, Washington, and Brussels. Translations were published, studied, and shared in classrooms. They became more than relics. They became a mirror, reflecting the quiet endurance of human feeling. Among the thousands displayed, one still stood apart. The letter addressed "To the Future." It remained behind glass, the ink faint but legible. School children pressed their faces to the display case to read the words, written more than 80 years earlier. It ended with a line that no one could forget. "If one day our words are read again, May they remind you that even in war, there were those who tried to protect love, not destroy it. That sentence became the closing note of every exhibition. Printed on the walls of museums and in history books, it captured the truth the war had tried to bury. That humanity, even under rubble, will find a way to speak. Today, the letters remain preserved in temperature-controlled archives, their ink stable, their papers safe. Yet their meaning continues to grow. Each generation that reads them adds a new layer to their message, a promise that memory will outlast destruction. The soldiers who found that bunker never imagined they would become guardians of voices from the other side. But in that frozen forest, they uncovered something stronger than victory: empathy. And so, in the quiet halls where the letters now rest, surrounded by light and glass, one can almost imagine the whisper of pages turning, the sound of lives still speaking, still being heard. In the silence that followed, the letters kept whispering long after the guns had gone quiet.